Growing up in the South, the heart of the Bible Belt, everyone I knew and surrounded myself with was a Christian, or at least believed in some sort of religion. I never realized that there are 75 million Americans that have no faith at all. This is important because that means there's ample opportunity to evangelize here in the United States to people we may not realize that identify as a nun. So the nun, they're people who have no religious affiliation, and the author Ryan P. Burge writes a book about it. So the thesis and the main overview of this presentation is going to be where they came from, who they are, where they're going. So you can see in this thesis that there are 75 million Americans, and then they're the fastest growing religion in America. And the main factors Burge credits to is secularization, internet, and the politics. These nuns share many common demographics, and they can be broken down into three groups: atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particular. And Burge also says globalization and big-scale secularization are two trends happening on a macro level that are giving rise to the nuns. And then even though this paints a grim picture for Christians, there are still actions we can take. So the 3Bs is what Burge uses to sort people into the main religious affiliations in the United States and their behavior, belief, and belonging. And so there are many different religious traditions in the United States, but here are the top 6 that Burge identifies in the chapter. And so evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, Black Protestants, Catholic, Jews, and others. So the first 5 groups have all seen a steady decline, while others, that includes like Mormons, Hindus, Buddhists, it's only group that has seen somewhat of a rise. So when we think about religion, it has to be thought of as a zero-sum game. If one group gets smaller, another group gets larger, which is what we saw with the 5 groups I just talked about. So the nuns, this group has seen exponential growth. Combining from all different polls, those with no religious affiliation is around 30%. And so there are 3 different groups of nuns, which we will get to later, but they once again include atheists, agnostics, and the nothing in particulars. And then many people who once identified as mainline Protestants are now nuns, and then the nuns are now the same size as Catholics and Protestants. So chapter 2 illustrates why the nuns are the fastest growing religious group in the United States. There's not one single reason because every person, their faith journey is different. However, these explanations that Burge offers are some of the most common factors. So secularization is the first possible explanation social scientists try to use. As society gains education and wealth, they'll gradually move away from religion. They prioritize the scientific process over divine intervention. This graph shows this trend. It's a graph on the left, and you can see the red arrows pointing to the United States. However, it's important to note that the U.S. is an outlier because according to this data, we should be at 0. Burge says that this is because of church and state. However, even though the U.S. is clearly an outlier, he still thinks secularization is one of the main driving forces, which is a critique I have, but we'll get to that later. And then we have also the social desirability bias. And so back 30 years ago, there's an underlying assumption that we should believe in God and should attend church. It was a positive social behavior. One study found that back 30 years or more ago, that half the people that said they attended church lied. This bias is declining today because there's less stigma against religion, and it's leading to people to be more accurate. The internet, it's made it possible for more honesty surrounding religion. It's broken the spiral of silence. People have found other nuns, and it's kind of just compounded on each other. So politics, he says that disaffiliation is directly related to political ideology. You can see on the bottom right graph. And he claims that politics is driving religion more than religion is shaping politics. Socialization, so 1 in 5 Americans have 0 or 1 close friends. Americans are more isolated than any part in history. People are stopped becoming and joining groups, and church is one of them. However, this data isn't too convincing since isolation is happening a lot faster than people are disaffiliating. And then loss of trust in government. He said lack of trust translates over to not being able to have faith. There was 77% trust of government in 1964, and now it's at 17%. Again, this is kind of a piece of the puzzle, not the main culprit. And then finally, we have changes in family structure. Religion is more likely to come from a stable home environment, and what we're seeing is less people are getting married, having kids while they're married, or having kids altogether. So the conclusion that Burge comes up with is that secularization, politics, and the internet are the three major causal factors given rise to the nuns. So chapter 3 then goes on to the demographics of disaffiliation. In other words, what are the characteristics of an average nun? We can see with this quote that since the nuns make up such a large part of the country, a nun looks like what an average American would look like. So first, Burge performed an age period cohort analysis. It's tempting to say that the rise of the nuns is because of the youth. This is true, but it's an oversimplification. Americans are getting older, but the nuns are growing more rapidly. Burge does this. He looks at age and period and how it works to influence you. And we can see some real patterns start to emerge. So this top left graph shows that religion looks like a roller coaster when it comes to age and period. It rises at certain parts of life and declines in others. So the graph on the left shows people tend to go to church as a youth, don't go to college, and they might start going against once they have a family. And then Burge also found that every successive generation is starting out as less religious, which is what the graph on the bottom left shows. When people enter adulthood without ever being religious, they are much more likely to stay this way, and the cycle continues with their kids. So with education, the evidence that education leads people away from religion is mixed and not very strong. Burge claims there is clear and unmistakable evidence that those who have completed a college degree are less likely to claim to be an atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. The data also indicates that those who have higher education levels are more likely to attend religious services. However, when it comes to religious belief, a different pattern emerges. Burge claims that those who have completed higher education are more likely to be skeptical of God's existence. The data with education is mixed because the type of people that got a college degree 50 years ago are very different than degrees today. And then next, Burge turns to gender of what the nun might be. Both genders are walking away from organized religion, but men are doing so at a higher rate, which you can see on the graph on the right. One important thing to note is that if you're childless, you're twice as more likely to be a nun. And yeah, that's what the graph on the right shows. And race, white nuns have increased 15%, Hispanics 13%, African Americans have jumped 20%, all since 2008. Burge says that cultural forces that shape minorities and white Americans are very different, so it's kind of hard to see what those forces are. And then this conclusion that Burge draws is that no segment of American society has been immune to the rise of disaffiliation. So all nuns are not created equally. You can't lump them all into one group. So we have atheists who deny the existence of God altogether, agnostics who neither believe nor disbelieves in a higher power. They avoid the negative label that comes with atheists. And then nothing in particular is they just reject all label. Picture this group as just shrugging their shoulder and being indifferent. They don't feel strongly one way or another. And then this group is the fastest growing group of the nuns, but they don't share the same intensity of the atheists and agnostics. So we can see different characteristics when we have broken the nuns into these three things. So education, atheists typically have the highest level of education, with agnostics closely behind, but only 1 out of every 4 nothing in particulars have completed a bachelor degree. When it comes to income, Burge found that nothing in particulars are the most educationally and economically disadvantaged groups in the U.S. 60% of the nothing in particular earn less than $50,000 a year. Additionally, when it comes to political ideology, atheists tend to be really liberal, agnostics not too far behind, and then nothing in particulars lean close to the middle, but they're a little left. And then the nothing in particulars are also less likely to participate in political activities than the general public. In the terms of religious attendance, however, they're also much less likely to engage in social activities. And then finally, when it comes to conversion rates, 1 out of every 6 nuns will move to a religious tradition at some point, but they might move back to being a nothing. Whereas with atheists, only 1 out of every 100 atheists will ever turn to religion. So once you break these groups down into three different groups, you can see how these trends emerge, and nothing in particular share little with atheists and agnostics, Burge claims, and they're the fastest growing religious groups and the most economically, socially, educationally disadvantaged. So he briefly touches on the effect of COVID. COVID shut down 80% of the churches and forced Americans to step away from church for a month or in some places longer. And the survey that he shows that the rise of the nuns grew by 5% over this time, which was much higher than expected. But he wanted to point out that this was simply because of punctuated equilibrium. The survey was connected, or that he used is usually conducted face-to-face, and it was conducted online in this time period, which caused people to be more honest. So he was a little concerned about this, but he said the nuns are continuing to rise at a steady rate, but COVID, he concluded, did not really speed this process up. So towards the end, Burge identified globalization and secularization, two things that are happening on a macro level. And he said these factors are giving a rise to the nuns because no one is immune. And the second point is really what he credited to. We're looking for someone to blame. So American workers are more productive, yet have less purchasing power than at any point in history. So we're looking to blame churches, government, anything we can. So it's turning people away from religion. Same thing with secularization, looking for someone to blame. And of course, he claims as modernity rises, people are turning away from religion. And then another point that he pointed out was that it's accelerating, and as of right now, it looks like that these two trends have no sign of slowing down in the world. And so towards the end of the book, Burge says, what's next? He says pastors can only do so much. He claims that America used to be Christian by default. We need to remember behind every nun there's a story. Nothing in particular are struggling socially, financially, politically. They're really at a disadvantage. He says we need to rise above partisanship and recognize every person is made in the image of God. We need to throw out the seed. We can't control what type of soil the seed lands on, but we can't stop throwing the seed altogether. So just to break it down for you again, with this thesis, we can see how they're the fastest growing religious group in the U.S., and the three micro factors he credits are secularization, internet, and politics. And we can see that the nuns as a whole group share a lot of different demographics, but once they're broken down into the three miniature groups, we can see a lot more of the clearer picture, and that globalization and secularization are the forces happening on a big scale picture. So one of the main weaknesses that some people argue is his focus on correlation and not causation. For example, those who do have low socioeconomic status, it doesn't have to cause someone to be a nun. They could just occur together. And that's kind of my problem that I had with secularization, is that he doesn't really prove causation that well, and so I didn't think it was that strong of an explanation. Another critique is that this book only focuses on the United States. The nuns are also increasing in Asia and Latin America by a significant amount, and he just doesn't mention that. And then the final critique is that the end is rushed and the advice is not practical. At the end, it says we need to listen and truly see the individual. Like, what does this actually look like? And how do we reach the nuns if they're not social or if we don't have much in common with them? So some strengths in this book is that Burge avoids stereotypes. At the beginning, he identifies like what the stereotypes of a nun is and what activities they partake in, and he uses data to modify or refute this. Another strength is how Burge breaks down the nuns into three different categories, which is something a lot of social scientists haven't done, so we can see even like a clearer picture. And then finally, Burge creates different graphs and models to show his data, some of which I included in this presentation, which really helps the reader visualize the trends he has observed. And so we can see some of the thinkers that we've talked about can connect to the ideas that Burge has suggested. Augustine would say the nuns are living in the city of man. Kuyper would say that the church sphere is shrinking its influence. Locke would say that church is a voluntary association and the nuns are winning out. And then Catholics would have say that the church is a weakening subsidiarity. And then here are some of the references that I used in my presentation. Thank you for listening.